They removed my name from the guest list, so I bought the wedding venue hours before. My name is Ava Sinclair, and I wasn't born into the Sinclair legacy, I was absorbed into it. I was 5 when my mother passed from a sudden stroke, and my father, too emotionally wrecked to care for a child, sent me to live with his brother's family for stability. Their home was 3 times the size of ours, with white-paneled columns and a piano no one ever played. I arrived with a backpack and a photograph. They greeted me like a lost kitten, fragile, quiet, needing shelter but never quite belonging. Growing up in that house was like living behind a glass wall. I had a seat at their table, but I wasn't part of their conversations. I wore the hand-me-down dresses of my cousin Charlotte, who was a year older and 2 sizes slimmer. At family parties, she sparkled in white tulle and ribbons, while I was the shadow who handed out drinks or helped clean up cake from the carpet. But Charlotte and I were close once. Before the family's subtle hierarchy settled in. Before her parents started comparing test scores, dance recitals, popularity. Before "you're so lucky to live with us" became the undercurrent of every smile I received. As we grew up, Charlotte floated upward: honors pageants, Ivy League internships. I stayed grounded, or so they assumed. But while they whispered about my lack of polish or pedigree, I was quietly studying, watching, learning, saving. While Charlotte bought her first car with her parents' credit, I bought my first stock at 17 with scholarship money. At 28, I opened my own financial consultancy firm. Within 5 years, it grew into a multi-million-dollar boutique agency catering to high-net-worth women, especially those overlooked, underestimated, or burned by systems designed against them. But despite my success, or maybe because of it, I was still the cousin who grew up in the guest room. I sent birthday gifts and attended events, but was rarely photographed. At Charlotte's engagement party, her mother thanked the entire Sinclair family for raising such a gem. I stood 2 feet away holding the camera. Still, when news of Charlotte's wedding broke, I didn't hesitate. I picked out a dress. I booked the flight. I even ordered a pair of Louboutins I didn't need. Because for all the cold shoulders and awkward glances, there was still a part of me, deep, naive, and annoyingly hopeful, that thought, maybe this time they'll see me. But the invitation never came. I waited for weeks, checking mailboxes, scanning emails, even calling the family assistant. Nothing. It wasn't until a former classmate posted on Instagram a glowing RSVP card that I realized I wasn't just forgotten. I was erased. I texted Charlotte. No response. I called Aunt Meredith. She sighed and said, "Ava, this is a small curated event. Immediate family only." I reminded her, "I am family." She replied, "Yes, but..." "You understand." Right. I understood perfectly. They didn't want me in the photos. They didn't want my face, with all its inconvenient history, showing up between the rows of generational wealth and curated perfection. They wanted to stage a wedding, a brand, a fairy tale for LinkedIn and society pages. And I didn't fit. That night, I sat in my apartment, modern, glass-walled, high above the city, and I stared out at the skyline. The insult stung more than I wanted to admit. Not because I missed them, but because somewhere deep down I'd still craved acknowledgement. But then, I smiled. Because if they didn't want me there as family, maybe I'd show up as something they couldn't ignore. I poured a glass of wine, opened my laptop, and typed 4 simple words into the search bar. Rosemarin Estate, for sale. They say revenge is best served cold. Mine. It came with a purchase agreement, a fire code clause, and the soft click of a lock turning shut. Subscribe if you believe revenge is best served quiet and with a property deed in hand. The Rosemarin Estate was a name whispered in hushed reverence across Manhattan's upper social circles. A 19th-century villa turned exclusive event space. It was renowned for its architecture's seclusion and exorbitant rental fees. Of course Charlotte would choose it. It matched her perfectly. Delicate on the outside, expensive on the inside, and impossible to get without a pedigree. I knew she'd book it the moment I saw the save-the-date photos online, her and Nathaniel, the finance heir, standing under the estate's iconic archway, smiling like royalty. The irony. I had a contact there. One of my former clients, a quiet divorcee who now ran venue acquisitions, owed me a favor. A big one. I reached out. Within 48 hours, the math was done. The venue was in a transitional phase, its lease-to-own agreement hanging by a thread due to underpayment. I offered double, in cash. Signed the dotted line 3 days before the wedding. No lawyers, no headlines. Just a silent transaction buried in a confidentiality clause. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it for recognition. Okay, maybe a little bit for revenge. See, I didn't intend to cancel her wedding. That would have been too dramatic. Too obvious. I wanted them to see me. Not scream my name in anger, but whisper it in awe, in fear, in respect. And nothing commands quiet fear like real power wielded calmly. The night before the wedding, I received a panicked voicemail from Aunt Meredith. Hi, Ava. Listen, there seems to be some confusion with the estate. They're asking for access permission. Could you call me back? I didn't. Instead, I sat in the Rosemarin Ballroom, my ballroom sipping coffee as the planners scrambled trying to figure out why their bride was suddenly a guest at someone else's venue. The staff had new instructions. The groom's family, still welcomed. The guests, still arriving. But the Sinclairs? They needed clearance. The morning of the wedding, Charlotte texted me for the first time in 2 years. Charlotte. Ava, what the hell did you do? Me. You mean what you didn't do? Invite your family. Silence. Then, Charlotte. We're still going to have the wedding. You can't stop this. I didn't respond. Because she was right. I wasn't going to stop it. I was going to reframe it. Literally, at noon, as the guests began filing into the garden courtyard, I watched from the second-floor window. Charlotte arrived in a custom Vera Wang pale and glowing. Nathaniel stood at the altar checking his cufflinks. Laughter filled the space. And then, I stepped out. I walked past the planner, past the decorators, down the stone path, heads turned. I wasn't in a dress. I wasn't in heels. I was in tailored navy slacks, black suede boots, and a silk blouse the color of cool thunderclouds. No makeup, no smile, just presence. Aunt Meredith turned ghost white. Uncle Grant adjusted his collar. Charlotte didn't even blink, but her fingers tightened on the bouquet. I stopped halfway down the aisle. I just came to say, "Congratulations," I said loud enough for the microphone to pick it up. "And to thank you for reminding me exactly where I stand in this family. It helped me decide where I want to stand from now on, and it's here, on my own property." Gasps. One of the guests whispered, "Did she say her property?" Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "You're not ruining this day." "I'm not," I smiled. "I'm elevating it." I turned to the chef who had come out mid-chaos, clipboard in hand. "Lunch is still on. Guests should enjoy the menu. In fact," I handed him an envelope. "This is a personal thank you. 50,000 for every staff member who worked today." He blinked, mouth open, took the envelope with trembling fingers. "You've been kinder to me in one day than this family has in decades." Then I looked at Charlotte. "You removed my name from the guest list. So I bought the building. Just to remind you, I was never a guest. I was a chapter you skipped. But I kept reading anyway." I walked away before the applause started. But I heard it. Soft. Then louder. Some clapped in awe, others out of confusion. But in that moment, I was no longer invisible. I was uninvited. And I had rewritten the RSVP. I didn't expect to stay long after that moment in the courtyard. Truth be told, I was prepared to walk out the minute I delivered my final line, disappear into the echoes, and let the scandal bloom behind me like smoke after a firework. But something about the stunned hush, the way everyone was frozen in place as I walked off, it felt unfinished, unsettled. So I stayed, not for them, not for closure, but for the record. I stepped back into the grand hallway, where portraits of former estate owners still hung in ornate gold frames. Men in dark coats, women in high collars, all frozen in oil paint and status. And for a split second I wondered, how many of them were like me? How many names were scrubbed from family trees before someone decided to carve their own? I made my way to the lounge where the photographer had set up a pristine space with soft lighting, plush velvet chairs, and a full-length mirror reflecting more truth than any wedding vow would. And there, standing stiffly against a linen backdrop, were Charlotte and Nathaniel, smiling for photos. trying desperately to pretend this was still their day. The photographer caught sight of me in the mirror and flinched, unsure whether to keep clicking or freeze. I gave him a small nod. Keep going. Let's capture this. All of it. Because these wouldn't be portraits they'd post on Instagram. These would be portraits they'd never share, but would never forget. Charlotte turned her expression schooled professional. If you're done making a scene. I haven't even started, I replied softly. Nathaniel cleared his throat. I don't know what your problem is, but if you think this intimidates me, you were always easy to intimidate, Nathan, I said. That's why you ghosted my texts the moment Charlotte told you I wasn't welcome. His eyes widened, but he said nothing. I'm not here to ruin your marriage, I continued. I'm here to make sure you remember who you erased to get it. There was a pause. The photographer looked down. Charlotte inhaled sharply through her nose. You know, I said, glancing around this room is where the estate used to hold arbitration sessions. Back when it was a private club for judges and diplomats. Arguments that shaped laws happened right where you're standing. I stepped forward, not threatening, just present. And here you are, writing your own law, erasing family, rewriting guest lists, assuming silence is agreement. Charlotte's voice cracked slightly. You never belonged at this wedding. No, I said. I belong here more than you think, because I'm not just family. I'm the only one who remembers when you were nothing but a scared girl hiding under the piano during storms. I held your hand at Dad's funeral when you couldn't speak. I stitched your dress when you couldn't afford alterations for your first internship gala. I held her gaze steady, and when you rose above me, I clapped. I smiled. I shrank. She looked away. I continued. But I've learned that shrinking doesn't keep you safe. It just makes it easier for people to step on you without looking down. I turned toward the mirror. My reflection stared back, same tailored slacks, same calm composure. But something in my eyes had changed. I wasn't invisible anymore. I'm done disappearing for other people's comfort, I said. Especially not for a sister who forgot who built her pedestal. Then, almost as an afterthought, I reached into my bag and pulled out a photo. A candid I took years ago. Charlotte mid-laugh sitting barefoot on a rooftop in college. The city behind her, a paper cup of wine in her hand. No makeup, no designer gown, just Charlotte. I handed it to her. Keep it, I said. This is who you were before the invitations got gold-trimmed. She didn't take it, so I left it on the vanity table. As I walked out, I passed guests whispering in the hall. Some avoided eye contact. Others nodded faintly. A few even smiled, not out of mockery, but recognition. Maybe they saw themselves in me, or maybe they just admired the courage it took to stand tall at someone else's altar. Outside, the light had shifted. Golden hour was beginning, the time of day photographers love most. The shadows lengthen, the glow softens, and even the harshest lines blur into grace. I lifted my phone and snapped a shot of the building from afar. Not for revenge. For proof that I was here, that I mattered, that my name, the one they removed, could never be erased from the history of this day. The reception was in full swing by the time I stepped out of the lounge. Music spilled into the courtyard, a string quartet trying to smooth over the silence I had just carved. The clink of champagne glasses forced laughter, and the occasional shuffle of expensive shoes filled the tension with a carefully curated soundtrack. On the surface, nothing had changed. But I could see it in their eyes now. People knew. They had questions. And no one wanted to be the one holding the answers. I found an empty seat at the edge of the garden terrace. Not at the family table that ship had sailed years ago. This chair was placed by the perimeter hedge facing the back of the main hall, half in the shadow of a jacaranda tree. I liked it that way. From there, I could see everything. The chandelier reflections on wine glasses, the crumpled place cards on unused seats, the guests growing quieter with each glass. The best man stood glass in hand. Let's raise a toast, he said, his voice catching just slightly. To Charlotte and Nathaniel, may your love be as strong as your ambition, and may your home be filled with joy and courage. I caught that last word. Courage. It landed with weight. Charlotte smiled, but her hands tightened around the stem of her glass. Nathaniel didn't meet her eyes. Unclaimed toasts are like ghosts, they linger, haunting what isn't said. There was supposed to be another toast. Mine. Weeks ago, I was meant to be part of it. I wasn't just the bride's cousin, I had known Charlotte longer than Nathaniel had. I had watched her grow into her ambition, her beauty, her sometimes brutal self-preservation. We were supposed to share a memory, a story that made everyone laugh, followed by something tender and forgettable. Instead, I sat under a tree unseen, drinking the same champagne I paid for when I bought out the venue that morning. Yes, I bought it. Hours before their ceremony, I wired a purchase agreement to the estate's board. I didn't stop the wedding. I didn't cancel the catering or send anyone home. I simply ensured the deed had a different name on it by 10 Isha. And that name was mine. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. Of space. Of worth. Of voice. A waiter, one of the kind ones, approached quietly and left a folded napkin beside me. Inside was a small note handwritten. For what it's worth, I saw you long before today. No signature. I didn't need one. Sometimes the smallest acts, the ones that whisper instead of roar, are the ones that steady your bones when everything else tries to make you vanish. I looked back at the party. Charlotte was laughing, but her eyes flickered toward the tree line. She saw me. I knew she did. And this time, she didn't look away. I stood, not to cause a scene, not to give a speech, but to leave a presence. I walked through the garden slowly past the white roses and down the gravel path toward the reception tent. Conversations hushed again, though no one dared stop me. I wasn't crashing anymore. I belonged, not because they said so, because I decided I did. Near the dessert table, an elderly woman grabbed my arm. One of the old aunts, the kind who used to pinch cheeks and serve unsolicited opinions. Her grip was firm. "You didn't deserve what they did," she said simply. Her eyes glistened. "But I'm glad you didn't vanish." "I'm not in the habit of vanishing anymore," I replied. She nodded, then let me go. That was all? At the edge of the tent, a microphone stood alone, waiting for the DJ or a final toast, or perhaps fate. I walked past it without a glance. My silence said more, because sometimes the most powerful speech is the one withheld. As I walked toward the exit, a young girl, maybe 9 or 10, tugged her mother's hand and pointed. "Mommy, who's that lady?" Her mother hesitated, then answered softly, "She's the one who owns this place." And just like that, the story began to shift. Not in shouts, not in scandal, but in whispers that would ripple long after the music stopped. The guest list had always been sacred in our family, meticulously curated, immaculately reviewed. My mother would agonize over the balance of prestige and propriety, which lawyer's wife must sit near the mayor's assistant who would be offended if placed behind a potted plant. For Charlotte's wedding, it had reached absurd levels. Seating charts became war maps. RSVPs were diplomatic victories. The entire affair was less about love and more about leverage. And I was a redaction, an inconvenient name blacked out with ink so thick it bled through the next page. I wasn't even supposed to know I had been removed. But someone had slipped me a copy, a blurry PDF sent anonymously from an email that no longer existed. Final seating confirmed. And there in the table, labeled Family Circle, was a blank line between Uncle Daniel and Cousin Elise, where my name used to be. No apology, no phone call, just a vanishing act. I was once again an asterisk in my own family. But what they didn't understand was this. You can remove a name from a piece of paper, but not from memory. Not from the stonework of the walls I now owned, not from the air of a place that now bore my signature on its deed. They had erased me from the guest list. I'd engraved myself in the foundation. Earlier that morning, after the venue transfer was finalized, I walked the grounds quietly with the estate manager, Mr. Carlyle. He was a kind-eyed man who had been working there for decades. This place has seen more secrets than confessions, he'd said, leading me past the rose garden. He didn't ask why I bought the place. He didn't need to. People like him know how to read stories without needing them told. As we paused at the fountain, the one where Charlotte had once tossed a coin and wished for a husband with a strong jawline and a stronger inheritance, I told him, "No changes for now. Let them have their fairy tale." "Just one addition." He raised an eyebrow. I handed him a brass plaque with a single line etched into it. "This space belongs to those who refuse to vanish." He nodded. no questions. That plaque was now mounted discreetly at the base of the main hall's archway. Most wouldn't notice, but some would. The ones who knew what it meant. As the reception wore on, whispers started to take root. I became the conversation they tried not to have, the shadow walking between white linens and laughter. Some said I'd come back for revenge. Others claimed it was an elaborate prank. But a few, the ones who knew Charlotte's history, suspected the truth. I hadn't crashed a wedding. I had reclaimed my story. Later that evening, while the band played their fourth rendition of Can't Help Falling in Love, I stood near the coat check sipping water from a crystal glass I technically now owned. I heard a group of guests talking not maliciously but curiously. She used to be her cousin, right? They grew up together. I thought she moved to Paris. Didn't she help pay Charlotte's tuition once? Each whisper stitched another piece of my presence back into the narrative. I wasn't invisible anymore, at least not to the right people. Then someone unexpected approached me. Nathaniel's younger sister, Mia, barely 22, fresh out of college, still naive enough to ask questions no one else dared. Why didn't they invite you? I looked at her. No bitterness. Just truth. Because they think love comes with conditions. She tilted her head, absorbing it. Do you regret showing up? I smiled gently. No. Because one day when someone tries to erase you, I hope you remember this. You can't be written out of a story you help write. She nodded slowly. That's kinda badass. I chuckled. Just don't say that in your toast. I wasn't invited to give one. We clinked glasses in silent solidarity. Before I left the tent, I took one final look at the official guest list printed and pinned on a nearby easel. Names in perfect gold calligraphy. Mine still absent. So I reached into my purse, pulled out a thin pen, and with the most elegant script I could muster, added my name beneath the final entry. Claire Morgan, owner. I didn't need permission. Just a pen, and the knowledge that no matter how hard they tried, I was part of this night. And I always would be. The truth is, I almost didn't go. I stood in front of the mirror that afternoon, fingers hovering over my necklace clasp, wondering if dignity sometimes meant walking away quietly. If letting them have their perfect evening was better than becoming a footnote of awkwardness. I wasn't sure what I feared more, being ignored or being noticed. But then I remembered every silent meal, every unopened birthday card I'd sent, every text left on read. And I remembered the precise moment I realized I'd been removed, not just from the guest list, but from the family ledger altogether. They didn't forget me. They chose not to include me. That's a different kind of cruelty. That's why I showed up. Not as a guest, not as family, but as a witness. As a woman who once begged to be seen, and now stood in a building that bore her name. When I walked through the iron gates that evening, hair tied back, heels, steady envelope tucked under one arm, I didn't look for familiar faces. I looked for exits. I needed to know how fast I could leave if everything went wrong. But what I didn't expect was how quickly everything began to go right. People recognized me, not just staff but guests, business acquaintances, neighbors, former classmates. A few blinked in surprise, unsure if they were supposed to speak. One of Nathaniel's groomsmen gave me a stiff nod, then pretended to adjust his cufflinks. And then the chef saw me, Andre Beaumont, the quiet genius behind the evening's 6-course menu. We'd met years ago at a food benefit gala, long before Charlotte ever dreamed of hiring him. I'd once invested in his downtown bistro when the banks wouldn't. He beamed, stepped from the kitchen, and offered a warm hug. Claire, mon Dieu, I had no idea this was your space now. It is, I said, at least as of this morning. He looked over his shoulder, lowered his voice. They didn't tell me you were coming. I would have prepared something special. I shook my head. They didn't know. A beat. And then he said it. I'm glad you're here. It was the first genuine sentiment I'd heard all evening. We talked for a moment longer about his upcoming cookbook, about the renovations I planned, and before he slipped away, I handed him the envelope. He opened it. Read the figure inside. His eyes widened. Claire, this is too much. It's not a tip, I said. It's a thank you for reminding me that showing up isn't always about being invited. Sometimes it's about knowing your own worth. He nodded slowly, folded the envelope back into his coat. And I knew in that moment I had made the right decision. Because showing up wasn't about proving anything to Charlotte, or to my parents, or to the dozen relatives who pretended not to see me. It was about proving it to myself. Proving that I could walk into a room where I was once unwelcome and still hold my ground. I drifted through the venue with calm, quiet presence, like a thread running through silk. I didn't disrupt the ceremony. I didn't make a scene. I let the night unfold. But every step I took reminded me that erasure only works if you stay silent. Near the bar, I saw Aunt Lorraine whisper to someone while pointing my way. Near the dance floor, two cousins glanced over, then quickly looked away. I smiled anyway. I sipped my champagne. I watched the people who once debated whether I was too emotional or too dramatic, now scramble to pretend they weren't stunned by my existence. It was delicious. And just a little heartbreaking, because I had loved them once. Deeply, earnestly. I had imagined being the kind of woman who gave heartfelt toasts, who linked arms with her sister under fairy lights, who watched her family grow, not shrink around her absence. But that night wasn't about grief. It was about presence, and the quiet kind of revenge that blooms not in fire but in grace. As the father-daughter dance began, Charlotte twirling to the melody of a string quartet, I watched from a distance. Not bitter, not angry, just aware and thankful. Thankful that I no longer needed their applause to know I mattered. Thankful that I showed up for myself. Because sometimes the most radical act you can perform is refusing to stay small, even when they try to shrink you, even when they cross your name off a list, even when they bet you wouldn't come. Especially then, there's a moment, a single breathless second, when the story you've always been told starts to fracture. For me, it came just after the first dance ended. Charlotte and Nathaniel dipped gracefully into their rehearsed twirl smiles, fixed and perfect. The applause came soft and polite, like everyone was trying not to wrinkle the napkins on their laps. I stood by a pillar half-shadowed by the amber lights above the floral arch. And that's when I heard it. A whisper. Wait, is that Claire? It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't full of venom. It was confusion, the kind that comes from seeing a character reappear in a story after you've written them out. I turned, and there she was. Cousin Grace. Wearing a peach gown and a tight bun, she looked like a woman still trying to impress our grandmother, even though Gran had been gone 5 years. We hadn't spoken since the incident when I pulled my investments from our family business. She had chosen sides. Not mine. But now she stepped forward, hesitant. Claire, she said. I didn't know you'd be here. I smiled gently. No one did. Her eyes narrowed slightly. I thought you and Charlotte weren't on good terms. I gave a soft shrug. Oh, I'm not here for Charlotte. She blinked. Then, why? I let the silence hang. I wanted her to sit with the discomfort of it, to feel the air shift. I'm here because this space is mine now, I said finally. I acquired it this morning. Her face went slack. You bought the venue. I nodded. And you weren't invited? No. She exhaled a sound between disbelief and fascination. That's bold. No, I said again this time, gentler. That's survival. Grace didn't reply for a long moment. And then, to my surprise, she took a sip of her champagne and murmured, I never agreed with how they treated you. You know, I gave her the only answer I could. But you didn't stop them either. Her silence this time was heavier. That's the thing about rewriting a narrative, you can't just change the words. You have to reckon with the old pages too. I walked away before the moment could turn into an apology. I wasn't here to collect regrets. I was here to reclaim truth. And that truth began unraveling more with every turn I took around the hall. Uncle David looked down at his plate when I passed. Aunt Sharon gave me a tight smile, one of those I'm being watched expressions people wear at funerals. No one asked what I was doing here. No one dared. Because the moment they acknowledged me, they had to acknowledge the version of the story that didn't fit. In their version, I was impulsive, too emotional, a little too sharp-tongued. I overreacted when Dad named Charlotte his business successor and asked me to just focus on charity work. I isolated myself when I stopped coming to family brunches, the ones where they pretended I didn't exist unless they needed money. In their story, I left. In mine, I was pushed out. In theirs, I was the disruption. In mine, I was the silence they refused to listen to. But now, standing in my venue dressed in navy silken heels that didn't falter on marble, I was no longer just rewriting the story. I was publishing it. Live. Charlotte walked past me at one point, arm in arm with Nathaniel. She saw me. Our eyes locked for half a second. There was no greeting, no accusation, but there was fear. The kind of fear you get when you realize the person you tried to erase is still here and stronger than before. That glance, that single flicker, was all the validation I needed. I didn't need a toast. I didn't need a dance. I didn't need a speech or a confrontation. Because revenge, real revenge, doesn't need applause. It just needs presence. And I was present fully, in every bite of food that came from a chef I funded, in every corner of architecture I now owned, in every whisper that rippled like static through the crowd as they tried to make sense of the story now rewriting itself before their eyes. I wasn't background anymore. I was the footnote that became the headline, and all I had to do was show up. The laughter in that room was practiced glossy and hollow like the surface of a cake too sweet to swallow. It bounced off the crystal glasses and gold-trimmed dinner plates, ricocheted off marble pillars, and dissolved into a fog of polite clinks and curated smiles. But I heard something beneath it. Not quite regret. Not yet. Not fear either. No, it was something more subtle. It was recognition. I stood in the far end of the ballroom, a glass of still water in hand, sipping slowly like I had all the time in the world. No one asked me to sit. No one offered a toast in my direction. But every so often I caught their eyes drifting toward me, curious, cautious, unsettled. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Let them wonder. Let them calculate. Because behind every laugh that burst too loudly, I saw the cracks forming, the sideways glances, the whispered speculations, the silent panic of a carefully controlled narrative slipping from their hands. The stories they had told about me, the ones passed around at brunch tables and charity galas, were unraveling faster than the silk ribbon on the wedding cake. She's back. Why would she be here? Did you hear she bought the venue? Do you think Charlotte knew? No one said it directly, but the energy in the room shifted like a power grid blinking in the dark, unsure of who was holding the switch. And that's when it happened. The band started playing a jazzy rendition of At Last, Charlotte's favorite. Nathaniel led her to the floor for the couple's second dance. The crowd clapped, moving in around them in a crescent moon of admiration. I remained where I was absorbing. It was then I noticed the detail no one else saw. Nathaniel's hand stiff on Charlotte's waist, her smile forced at the corners. The space between them not wide but telling. The kind of space that isn't seen with the eyes but felt in the stomach. I tilted my head. Interesting. The photographer took shots from every angle, clicking furiously to capture the glow of what was supposed to be eternal love. But the glow was dimmer now. It was as if the air itself knew something had shifted. Like the walls wanted to whisper, "Something's wrong." I turned away from the dance and made my way toward the hallway that led to the catering quarters. There, I found Matthew, the executive chef, tall, precise, and loyal as ever. He glanced up from his clipboard when he saw me. "Claire," he said with a grin, still standing. "I thought they'd have chased you out by now." "Would have been difficult," I replied. "I hold the keys." He chuckled. "Everything runs smoothly?" I asked. "As smooth as a soufflé," he said, raising an eyebrow. Although, I did notice something odd. "Oh!" "The groom," he said, lowering his voice. "Earlier he took a call just outside the kitchen loading dock. Looked flustered. Said something about not now and she's here." My brows lifted slightly. "Who's she?" "No idea." But he didn't mean Charlotte. A pulse of cold flickered down my spine. Not because I cared for Charlotte's fate, but because it confirmed something I hadn't even let myself articulate. There was more here. More than exclusion. More than family pride. There were secrets. Ones they thought would stay buried beneath the cake tears and champagne bubbles. But that's the thing about truth. It echoes. It echoes beneath the laughter, behind the applause. Inside the pauses, people hope no one notices. I turned back toward the ballroom. The song had ended. Charlotte and Nathaniel were bowing slightly. Guests were clapping, the DJ launching into an upbeat tune. But their faces told a different story. Charlotte's jaw was tight. Nathaniel's brow creased as if the weight of the evening had just begun pressing on his spine. And in that moment, I decided I wasn't done yet. Not with this night. Not with this narrative. I hadn't come just to be seen. I had come to listen, to document, to find the threads they tried to cut and weave them back into a tapestry no one could ignore. Because even if I was never going to be the bride or the guest of honor or the family favorite, I had power. I had truth. And tonight I had their undivided, unspoken attention. The echo was getting louder, and I was just getting started. The air inside the venue had begun to thin, not literally, but emotionally. You could feel it. Like when you enter a room where a fight has just ended but no one wants to admit it. The wine was still flowing, the band still playing, but something was off-kilter. Attention too well-dressed to name. I stepped out through the side corridor and back into the kitchen hallway. The staff knew to part when I passed a subtle nod here, a hushed ma'am there. I wasn't a guest. I was the owner. And that changed everything. As I passed the rear service entrance, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I never answered those. But something intuition, or maybe just curiosity, made my thumb hover. The screen lit again with a second message. This time a text. She's here. What do we do? My breath caught for half a second. Then another buzz. I told you not to invite her. And finally, delete these. 3 messages, all from the same number, sent not to me, but meant for someone else. Someone who shared my area code. Someone whose number was likely 1 or 2 digits off. Someone in this very building. I opened my photo app, took a screenshot, then another just in case. Digital breadcrumbs. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I dialed the number back. It rang once. Twice. Then it clicked over. Hello? The voice was low, male, and cautious. I said nothing. Charlotte. Bingo. A pause. Who is this? The voice asked again, harder now. I didn't respond. I let the silence do the work. Did you listen? If this is about earlier, it's nothing. She's just some old client. Don't overreact. Click. He hung up. My hands tightened around the phone. Old client. Nathaniel. So that's what I was now. Not the ex who helped him get through 2 failed startups. Not the woman who once co-signed his business loan when no one else would. Just a name in his rear view. But I wasn't in the rear view anymore. I walked calmly back to the ballroom. The lighting had dimmed slightly for the dinner portion of the evening. Candles flickered on every table. Waitstaff moved like dancers between courses. It was elegant, controlled, until I spotted him. Nathaniel stood near the cake table, flanked by 2 of his groomsmen, laughing too hard at a joke that clearly wasn't funny. His phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, froze, then scanned the room like a man who'd just heard a ghost whisper his name. When his eyes landed on me, I didn't blink. I simply raised my glass. He turned pale, and just like that, the power shifted again. Later that evening, the toasts began. The maid of honor recited a heartfelt speech. The best man tried too hard to be funny. Charlotte dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed napkin. Nathaniel tried to look moved. Then Charlotte's father stood up. Before dinner concludes, he began, I just want to thank everyone who helped make this day special, especially the stunning venue and its team. He lifted his glass toward the back of the room, clearly searching for the venue manager. I took a step forward. Heads turned. Faces flickered with slow recognition. I'm sorry, I said, voice calm, sure. But you might want to direct that toast to me. A silence dropped over the room like velvet. Charlotte blinked. What? I own this venue, I said, still gentle. Bought it this morning. The ripple of shock was delicious, a mix of gasped stares and 1 or 2 forks clattering to plates. But why? Charlotte asked, voice trembling. I smiled faintly. Because sometimes when you're not invited to the table, you buy the whole house. It sits in. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. Charlotte's father sat down without finishing his toast. No one clapped. No one dared. But in that moment, everyone knew I wasn't there to crash a wedding. I was there to rewrite a legacy. And the next move wasn't mine. It was theirs. The silence from the toast hung heavy in the air. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath that no one wanted to exhale. I could see the gears turning in Charlotte's mind, trying to rationalize, trying to decide whether to smile to lash out or to faint. I turned to leave, not out of retreat, but as punctuation. The moment had landed. Staying would have made it petty. Leaving made it powerful. But then I heard my name. Isabel. I paused. It wasn't Charlotte. It wasn't Nathaniel. It was her mother. She stood now, hands clenched in front of her expensive lilac gown, eyes sharp. Why would you do this? You've made a scene. You've ruined the happiest day of their lives. I turned back slowly, keeping my gaze level. Did I raise my voice? Interrupt the ceremony. Flip a table. That's not the point, she snapped. You're being cruel. I walked a few steps closer, still calm. No. Cruel was erasing my name from a list after I RSVP'd. Cruel was pretending I didn't exist while using the very venue I had recommended, the one I said I was looking to purchase. Remember that dinner? She stiffened. I didn't make this a scene. I added. You all just didn't expect the backdrop to speak. Charlotte stepped in, then her voice brittle. You had no right to ambush us like this. I tilted my head. I didn't ambush anyone. I just showed up, same as the caterers, same as the band, same as every other contract that made this wedding happen. Nathaniel finally joined his face tight with embarrassment. Isabel? Look, I don't know what you think you're trying to prove. I'm not trying to prove anything, I interrupted. I've spent enough years trying to prove I was worthy of a seat. Today I proved something to myself. He looked like he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. So I said it for him. You used me. You drained me during your entrepreneurial phase. I helped you get on your feet. And when you stood up, you walked away. Charlotte looked at him. Then something flickering in her expression. I moved on, Nathaniel said defensively. We weren't even talking by the time I proposed. But you were still using the space I told you about. Still talking to my friends in real estate. Still pretending I was nothing while walking on the stones I laid down. Charlotte finally spoke again softly. Why here? Why now? I met her gaze. Because when someone locks the front door, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is buy the whole house. There it was. The moment that would be whispered about long after the flowers died and the cake was boxed up. The moment that made the silence louder than the band ever could. I turned once more to leave. But then someone clapped. Just one person. A middle-aged woman seated near the back. Then another, then three. It wasn't raucous. It wasn't disruptive. It was respectful. Acknowledgement. The claps faded quickly, but the impact didn't. I didn't look back again as I walked out. I didn't need to. The confrontation had happened, and no one would forget it. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove to the small office above my favorite bookstore, the one I'd been renting quietly for months now. It wasn't just a workspace. It was my vault. A place where every version of me hurt, ignored, dismissed, had left behind something powerful. Records, paper trails, receipts, and truth. I unlocked the drawer where I kept everything. My fingers moved without hesitation. Contracts, email printouts, bank statements, a copy of the original proposal I made to Nathaniel 2 years ago, offering him co-investment in the venue. Dated, signed, ignored. And then there were the emails from Charlotte back when she still pretended I was just Isabel, the brilliant one. She had asked for caterer recommendations, for florists, for musicians. I had responded generously, and somewhere along the way, they had decided I was disposable. They hadn't even bothered to scrub the metadata. In a world that moves fast, people forget. Silence can be documented. I sat at my desk flipping through the files one by one, letting the weight of each proof fall like bricks back into place. Not because I needed revenge, not anymore, but because if anyone dared challenge the truth, I wouldn't just have a comeback. I'd have evidence. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Charlotte. Why are you doing this? No greeting, no apology, no punctuation. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because sometimes the most powerful response is one that leaves space for them to hear their own echo. Another buzz, this time from Nathaniel. You've made your point. I stared at the screen, letting the sentence sit. Then I typed, it wasn't about making a point. It was about reclaiming my voice. I hit send, no more, no less. 10 minutes later, an email pinged into my inbox from a wedding columnist at a local lifestyle magazine. Somehow someone had tipped them off. They wanted a quote, a statement, a story. I closed the laptop. No, this story, my story, wasn't going to be reduced to a headline or a viral article. It wasn't for clicks. It was for closure. And besides, the wedding was over. The guests would talk. The rumors would spread. But I knew what would remain long after the gossip died. The deed, my name, in black and white. As the sole owner of the venue, I stood by the window watching the lights of the city flicker like the fading memories of the evening. Somewhere out there, they were probably replaying every moment, looking for cracks, looking for ways to spin it. But the paper trail doesn't lie. And this time, I wasn't the one being erased. I was the signature they couldn't forge. And now, it was time to start writing my own chapters, the ones no one else would get to edit. Back at the venue, my venue, the echoes of clinking glasses and distant laughter had faded, leaving only the hum of cleaning crews and soft music still playing somewhere in the distance. I stood at the back of the main hall staring at the now empty arch, where Charlotte and Nathaniel had just hours earlier stood and exchanged their carefully crafted vows. A moment that had been rehearsed, memorized, and embellished with poetry they didn't write, and promises they didn't mean. I knew because I had once drafted my own vows long ago, back when Nathaniel was still just Nate, a man I thought I could build a life with. I had written them in a leather-bound journal I kept hidden at the bottom of a drawer. They weren't poetic, they weren't perfect, but they were honest, raw, real. And tonight, for the first time, I wanted to speak them aloud, not to him, but to myself. I walked up to the arch alone. The floral arrangements were starting to wilt. The candles burned low. I pulled the small journal from my coat pocket open to the first page and began to read quietly to the empty chairs, to the ghosts of what could have been. I vow never to make myself small just to be loved. I vow to trust my instincts even when they make others uncomfortable. I vow to stop apologizing for being too much, too loud, too smart, too ambitious. I vow to love fully but never foolishly again. And above all, I vow to never forget who I am, even when others pretend I don't exist. My voice cracked halfway through, but I kept reading. Each word felt like reclaiming a piece of me that had been buried beneath years of compromise, of quiet tolerance, of letting others decide where I fit and how I showed up. And when I reached the last line, I felt something shift like the closing of a door behind me. It was never about revenge. Not really. It was about finally being heard by the only person who had ever needed to hear me, myself. Just then, I heard footsteps. I turned to see an older woman standing at the entrance to the hall. She looked like someone's aunt or godmother in a lavender dress heels dangling from her hand. "You're the woman who owns this place, aren't you?" she asked. I nodded. She smiled. "Good. I just wanted to say that was the most dignified chaos I've ever witnessed. And frankly, long overdue." She winked and walked off barefoot and smiling. And somehow, that one small acknowledgement felt louder than all the applause they'd gotten hours before. Outside, the night was turning cold. I stepped into the crisp air, still holding the journal in my hands. The last guests were gone. The cars had pulled away, but I wasn't walking away empty-handed. I had something they never gave me, something they couldn't take. A truth spoken aloud. A vow fulfilled not for a wedding, not for a man, but for a woman who had finally learned that silence, when broken, can be the most powerful vow of all. The morning after the wedding, sunlight spilled through the cathedral windows of the grand hall. The staff moved quietly, picking up rose petals and empty glasses, the aftermath of yet another celebration where my name hadn't been spoken, yet my presence had echoed in every corner. But this time, I wasn't invisible. I sat at the corner table where the planners had tried to hide me the day before. Today it was mine. My coffee steamed beside a stack of paperwork, renovation contracts, event calendars, and something far more personal. The original title deed to the venue, signed and dated 3 weeks ago under my name. It hadn't been easy buying the estate. In fact, it had been one of the most complicated negotiations of my life. The venue had been family-run for generations until mounting debt forced them to sell. And I had been there waiting quietly, patiently with a cashier's check and a proposal that respected its history, but rewrote its future. They had no idea, of course. Charlotte thought she was booking her wedding through a company called Whitewood Events, a small firm I had created under an LLC that linked back to nothing recognizable. Layers of privacy. Intentional anonymity. I didn't need them to know. Not yet. I watched as the florists packed up what remained of the centerpieces. I thought about how many nights I had spent feeling small dinners where I was the forgotten cousin, the plus one to my own achievements. And here I was signing contracts in the very place they thought would define them. Ownership doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just watches. It listens. It waits for the right moment to speak, and then it does so with undeniable clarity. As I stood and made my way to the gallery wing of the venue, I passed the photo wall hundreds of framed moments from weddings, galas, and fundraisers. But today I had something to add. A single photo taken the night before. It wasn't of the bride, or the groom, or the cake. It was a candid shot of the kitchen staff all huddled together, exhausted, beaming arms slung around each other in celebration of getting through another chaotic event. The real workers, the invisible ones, just like I had once been. I placed the photo in the center of the wall beneath a small brass plaque that read, "To those who made the magic." Even when they weren't invited to the table, this wasn't just my statement. It was my legacy. The venue wouldn't just be a backdrop for picture-perfect events anymore. It would host women-led panels, small business showcases, and art exhibits by those who had once been told they were too much or not enough. It would celebrate the misfits, the quiet rebels, the ones like me. And that $50,000 tip I'd left in the envelope, it had gone directly into the staff development fund split among every cook, server, florist, and custodian who had worked that wedding. I'd even hired a few of them to join my new permanent team. Let Charlotte and Nathaniel have their curated wedding album and social media highlight reels. I had something better. I had rewritten the story from the inside out, not with fury, but with focus. Not through sabotage, but through ownership. And as I stood at the threshold of the venue's private library, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't revenge that tasted sweet. It was reclamation. It was realizing that for every door that was closed in my face, I had the tools, the grace, and the sheer audacity to build a home beside it and let others in. Especially the ones like me. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding. The social media buzz had already moved on, replaced by honeymoon snapshots, curated gratitude posts, and comments from people who never knew what really happened that day. To the world, it was just another picture-perfect event, a union of two successful families, a glamorous night in a beautiful venue. They still didn't know it was mine, and that somehow made it sweeter. I hadn't spoken to Charlotte since the night of her wedding when she brushed past me with a barely there smile and a practiced thank you. She didn't ask why I was there. She didn't wonder how I had gotten access to the private prep suite. Maybe she assumed I was a plus one, or part of the background. That's the thing about people like her. They assume power looks like them. But the emails started coming a few days later. First from her wedding planner, then from the venue's previous owner who let it slip that the Anderson Foundation had sold the estate due to mounting debt. Then came Charlotte's assistant subtly inquiring about the next available date at Whitewood, not knowing she was speaking to me. And then, silence. Until this morning. I was sitting in the sunroom of the estate now, fully under renovation to become an event and empowerment hub, when a knock interrupted my coffee. "Miss Morgan," a voice called through the glass. It was Nathaniel, alone. I let him in, quietly. He wasn't dressed like the polished groom from a few weeks ago. No suit, no watch. Just jeans, a wrinkled button-up, and eyes that carried the weight of something unspoken. "I didn't know," he said, standing in the foyer beneath the crystal chandelier I had chosen for the redesign. "Didn't know what?" I asked, not moving from my chair. "That you own this place. That it was you who—" "All of it." "I didn't hide it," I replied. "I just didn't announce it." He sat slowly. His fingers fidgeted with a cuff button that didn't need adjusting. She's not handling it well," he finally said. Of course not. Charlotte had spent her life collecting appearances. The right shoes, the right friends. the right fiancé. But she had never learned how to respond when the ground shifted when someone she once looked down on had quietly outmaneuvered her without saying a word. "I'm not here for pity," I said. "Or approval. You don't owe me either." I know he nodded. "But I came to say something anyway." He paused, then looked at me, really looked, for the first time since we were teenagers. "You changed the ending," he said quietly, "and you didn't need to humiliate anyone to do it. That takes more strength than people like us know how to name." That hit something deep inside me, because the truth was, for all the vengeance I could have taken the toasts, I could have disrupted the secrets I could have spilled, I hadn't. I had chosen silence. Not out of fear, but because I knew there's a kind of justice louder than anger. It's presence. It's ownership. It's simply being where they tried to erase you and letting that fact do the talking. Nathaniel left soon after. I didn't walk him out. Later that day, I held a small event in the East Wing, a photography exhibit featuring women artists who had never been publicly shown. The room was full, not with the elite, but with teachers, caretakers, immigrant mothers, survivors, poets, women who had worked invisible jobs and carried invisible scars. I didn't make a speech, but as I stood near the back watching them admire the work and sip cider beneath my family's old chandeliers, a quiet ripple began to spread. A few women looked my way, smiled, nodded. Some clapped. It wasn't loud, but it was everything. It was the silent applause I had never received. Not at family dinners, not at graduations, not at galas where my name was printed wrong or skipped entirely. This applause wasn't for a performance. It was for a reclamation. It was for building something not just despite being excluded, but because of it. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Forgiveness doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like creating a new world where your voice and the voices of those like you are finally heard. No grand finale, no takedown, just truth and peace, and something that finally felt like home. The letter arrived in a gold-embossed envelope. It was from Charlotte. Handwritten, short. Not an apology, not a thank you. Just a question. Was it worth it? I read it twice before folding it back neatly and placing it in my drawer. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because she didn't deserve to hear it. The truth was, the moment I bought the venue, the place she and her family thought they controlled, I reclaimed something far more valuable than square footage. I reclaimed narrative, dignity, self-worth. That was the part Charlotte would never understand. To her, worth was defined by appearance. By whose name was on the program. By who got the better table, the better dress, the louder applause. But to me, worth had become something quieter, something deeply rooted in integrity. After the exhibit, I started getting emails from women who attended. Some asked if they could volunteer at the new center I was opening at the estate. Others shared their own stories of erasure, of being left off guest lists, off wills, off family group texts, off the map entirely. And still they endured. Still they rose. Just like me. At the opening night of Whitewood, reclaimed the new name for the estate. I walked through those same gates again, but this time, not as an outsider or a shadow. I was the host. I was the owner. Dozens of women gathered beneath the string lights and chandeliers we had repurposed from the wedding. The same lights that once lit a room I wasn't invited into now lit a room I built. I stood at the front of the hall looking at the place where Charlotte once gave her vows and I gave my own. To myself, silently. I vowed that no one would ever silence me again, that I would never wait to be chosen when I could choose myself, and that any door slammed in my face would one day be mine to unlock for someone else. After the event, I returned home to find one last envelope, not from Charlotte, but from an older woman I barely remembered. My great-aunt Rosemary. The note was brief, but powerful. Your mother always said you were too sensitive. I say you were listening? Thank you for finally making our name mean something. I left something for you in the family attic. It's always been yours. The next morning, I drove to the old Carter family home. No one lived there anymore. It had been put up for sale after my father passed, but the attic was still untouched. They're buried in a trunk beneath decades of dust and neglect, I found it. An old photo album, not of Hannah, not of parties or awards, but of me, pictures I didn't even know existed. My drawings taped on the fridge, me dressed as a camera for Halloween, me with paint on my face, laughing so hard my eyes disappeared. And inside a note in my father's handwriting, she sees what we don't. Don't let us lose her. He never showed it to me. Maybe he never meant to, or maybe he never found the courage. But somehow, in that quiet space, I forgave him. Not because he asked for it, but because I no longer needed to carry that weight. I returned to Whitewood one last time before its official handover to the trust. I walked through the ballroom past the spot where Charlotte had tossed her bouquet, and the family had clinked their champagne glasses pretending I wasn't there. And then I walked outside into the courtyard under the same stars that had watched me that night. I took one final deep breath and whispered to the wind, "You thought you'd have the final word? But it was mine all along." If this story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever been made to feel invisible at your own family's table, then you're not alone. Subscribe for more true stories where silence becomes power, where the overlooked find their voice, and where justice is reclaimed in the most unexpected ways.